Welcome back. Our previous episode examined Muslim expansion as demographic growth without corresponding technological advancement. We discovered how extensive versus concentrated approaches to civilizational progress create measurably different strategic capabilities. Today, we'll explore how these patterns manifest in specific contemporary situations. We'll examine developments in Turkey and Iran, and the broader process of global Muslim demographic expansion, and why population growth may not automatically translate into strategic dominance. This analysis will reveal the practical implications of extensive versus concentrated approaches in modern geopolitics, the challenges of Muslim demographic expansion for European societies, France, Great Britain, Germany, Italy, Spain, continue to intensify. Political leaders in these countries acknowledge uncertainty about managing these demographic shifts. Turkey is actively pursuing religious revival and gaining political influence and military capabilities. The Republic of Iran is mobilizing its resources for strategic competition with Western powers. A situation is gradually developing where the West, with its emphasis on technological innovation, rationalism, and organizational efficiency, faces growing demographic and territorial expansion from Muslim societies. This creates what some analysts call a potential quality versus quantity dynamic in international relations. Leaders in the Muslim world increasingly declare that comprehensive religious revival requires both spiritual renewal and political transformation. Such perspectives are promoted with the stated goal of expanding Muslim influence globally. Scholar Sultanov believes that global Muslim demographic expansion can no longer be prevented. In his analysis, the contemporary global situation has accelerated what he calls the revitalization process, the revival and strengthening of traditional values and principles, and increasingly organized rejection of Western rationalism and secularism. Among intellectual and spiritual leadership in the Muslim world, there is a process of moving away from liberal and secular approaches. The desire for long-term religious self-determination of Muslim communities is intensifying. In this expanding traditional environment, the process of organized opposition to Western individualistic values by anthropocentric Western approaches is intensifying. However, the reality suggests that the strengthening of Muslim influence through demographic growth and passionate commitment may not automatically enable political dominance or realization of comprehensive global influence. Due to what we discussed as limitations in concentrated advancement capabilities, in the modern interconnected world, Muslim societies face challenges in implementing what scholars call concentrated information political, scientific technical, economic, and military expansion. There appear to be organizational limitations in Muslim educational and social frameworks for developing highly productive individual creativity, advanced technological innovation, and sophisticated organizational efficiency that characterizes modern strategic competition. There are insufficient foundational elements in traditional Muslim approaches for forming what Western political science calls civil society in its liberal individualistic understanding. There are limited precedents for developing organized political structures along European models. Few Muslim states have successfully implemented such approaches. However, the expanding Muslim world of over 1 billion people in the 21st century will likely demand that Western powers reconsider their universalist claims that present Western values as unconditional and obligatory truths, which are essentially derived from Protestant foundational traditions. In their relations with Muslim societies, Western political entities maintain uncompromising attitudes toward the universality and comprehensiveness of their individualistic liberal values. At the same time, a persistent expectation remains of the possibility of organizational transformation of Muslim societies along Western lines. This expectation stems from two important factors. First, the strategic thinking of decision-makers in the Anglo-Saxon world is based on foundational principles that differ significantly from Muslim approaches. Second, they do not regularly reflect on their own liberal values, considering them natural and universal rather than historically specific products of Protestant advancement. This is why contemporary global politics, determined by the Euro-Atlantic powers, which are now more American Atlantic than European, is characterized by recurring expectations about alleged growing unpredictability of political processes in the Muslim world. The problem of mutual misunderstanding between the West and the Middle East is further complicated by the fact that in the Muslim world, perceptions of Western policies as problematic are also growing. To address the challenge of apparent strategic incompatibility, Western political entities would need to develop more sophisticated understanding of their actual political opportunities in interaction with Muslim societies. Strategic reflection would require rethinking fundamental assumptions, both about their own political thinking and about the distinctive characteristics of various Muslim communities. However, it proves extremely difficult for each side to move beyond established foundational principles to new levels of strategic understanding. The approaches adopted centuries ago have formed rigid structures of mass commitment that serve as foundations of identity. At the same time, it is necessary to recognize that fundamental approaches represent what scholars call affirmation of eternal truths. Neither side intends to abandon these eternal truths, since this would constitute an unacceptable rejection of core identity. Foundational approaches determine cardinal psychological and ultimately political differences between major global regions, the world of Muslim societies, the world of the Christian West, and the world of Orthodox Christianity. All have been developing for extended historical periods according to monotheistic ideals at their cores. Each defends organized values and expresses civilizational political orientations in distinctive ways. Within each of these worlds, there exists relatively autonomously the world of Judaism, whose main ally is the Protestant Anglo-American coalition. The strategically weakest element in this network appears to be post-Orthodox and post-Soviet Russia, whose leading groups have twice rejected the foundational principles of their political identity. The first rejection manifested in the destruction of Orthodox foundational confession as the basis of Russian civilization. This process, lasting approximately 2 centuries, eventually led to the collapse of thousand-year-old Russian statehood and society. The result was the tragedy of 1917, civil war, and destruction of orthodoxy as an organizing component of the Russian state. The second rejection, this time from organized atheism, was carried out by post-Orthodox and post-Stalin Soviet leadership, with delegation of political identity to leaders of the Protestant West. The organized rulers of the late USSR were unable to offer people transcendental foundations for social and political progress, unable to form intellectual immunity in the Soviet people against Western ideological influence and organized expansion. By the beginning of perestroika, the majority of the Soviet population had adopted individualistic and consumerist attitudes. Post-Orthodox and post-Soviet Russia, under leadership committed to liberal democracy, without acquiring clear foundational principles for policy, continues to face strategic challenges. This process has continued for more than a quarter century, accompanied by ongoing discussions about finding a national idea, acquiring universal human values, developing democracy and civil society. Researchers rightly observe that power networks worldwide are becoming less effective because they account for a narrow range of motivations for political behavior. The deep foundational and spiritual attitudes of large populations are not adequately studied in political science knowledge, and as a result, are often ignored in strategic planning. The challenges facing liberal civilization, which has prioritized commercial success over transcendent values, have strengthened the position of Muslim societies with their capacity for mass mobilization and political action. The Western world approaches the culmination of the path established during the Reformation and modern era. The Muslim East, with its emphasis on demographic expansion rather than technological innovation, directs itself toward organized revival, potentially intensifying confrontation with the secular West. This creates complex strategic dynamics. Extensive Muslim expansion through demographic growth and territorial influence encounters, concentrated Western progress through technological innovation and organizational efficiency. The outcome of this encounter will likely depend on which approach proves more strategically effective in contemporary global conditions: quantity-based demographic expansion or quality-based technological and organizational advancement. In our next episode, we'll examine Western responses to these challenges and explore potential scenarios for managing foundational differences between these contrasting civilizational approaches. How do Western powers attempt to address Muslim expansion while maintaining their universalist commitments? What are the strategic implications of foundational incompatibility between different civilizational models? If you're interested in how foundational differences create contemporary geopolitical challenges, subscribe to the channel. In comments, share your observations about how demographic expansion and technological advancement create different types of international influence. See you next episode, where we'll explore Western illusions about transforming Muslim societies. Welcome back. Our previous episode examined developments in Turkey and Iran and the broader process of global Muslim demographic expansion. We discovered how extensive approaches through population growth encounter concentrated Western progress through technological innovation. Today, we'll explore Western responses to these challenges and examine persistent expectations about transforming Muslim societies along Western lines. We'll analyze why these transformation efforts often fail to achieve intended results. This analysis will reveal the strategic implications of foundational incompatibility between contrasting civilizational approaches. In their relations with Muslim societies, Western political entities maintain comprehensive commitment to their individualistic liberal values. These values are presented as universal principles applicable to all human societies. At the same time, a persistent expectation remains regarding the possibility of organizational transformation of Muslim societies along Western institutional models. This expectation appears to be based on fundamental assumptions about the adaptability of different civilizational frameworks. This perspective stems from two important factors. First, the strategic thinking of decision-makers in the Anglo-Saxon world operates from foundational principles that differ significantly from Muslim approaches to social organization. Second, Western political leadership often does not regularly reflect on their own liberal values as historically specific developments. Instead, they tend to regard these values as natural and universal, rather than products of particular Protestant and Enlightenment traditions. This is why contemporary global politics, determined primarily by Euro-Atlantic powers, which are now more American-Atlantic than European, is characterized by recurring expectations about alleged growing unpredictability of political processes in the Muslim world. Western strategic planning frequently assumes that Muslim societies will eventually adopt Western institutional models through exposure to liberal democratic values and market economic approaches. The problem of mutual misunderstanding between the West and the Middle East is further complicated by reciprocal perceptions. In the Muslim world, perceptions of Western policies as problematic and culturally invasive are also growing. Many Muslim intellectuals and political leaders view Western universalist claims as forms of cultural imperialism that fail to respect the integrity of Muslim civilizational approaches. To address the challenge of apparent strategic incompatibility, Western political entities would need to develop more sophisticated understanding of their actual political opportunities in interaction with Muslim societies. Strategic reflection would require rethinking fundamental assumptions both about their own organized approaches and about the distinctive characteristics of various Muslim communities and their historical patterns. However, it proves extremely difficult for any civilizational framework to move beyond established foundational principles to genuinely new levels of strategic understanding. The organized approaches adopted centuries ago have formed what scholars call rigid structures of mass commitment that serve as foundations of collective identity and meaning. At the same time, it is necessary to recognize that fundamental approaches represent what philosophers call affirmation of eternal truths. Neither Western nor Muslim civilizations intend to abandon these foundational truths, since this would constitute an unacceptable rejection of core identity and meaning networks. Organized approaches determine cardinal psychological and ultimately political differences between major global civilizational regions. These include the world of Muslim societies, the world of the Christian West, and the world of Orthodox Christianity. All have been developing for extended historical periods according to their particular interpretations of monotheistic ideals. Each defends organized values and expresses civilizational political orientations through distinctive institutions and practices. Each of these civilizational worlds maintains internal coherence while expressing fundamental differences with alternative approaches to human organization and meaning. Within each of these major civilizational frameworks, there exists the relatively autonomous world of Judaism, which has maintained strategic alliance with the Protestant Anglo-American coalition throughout the modern period. The strategically most vulnerable element in this global network appears to be post-Orthodox and post-Soviet Russia, whose political leadership has twice organizationally rejected the foundational principles of their civilizational identity. The first rejection manifested in the gradual destruction of orthodox foundational frameworks as the basis of Russian civilization. This process, extending over approximately 2 centuries, eventually contributed to the collapse of traditional Russian institutional structures. The result included the revolutionary upheavals of 1917, subsequent civil conflict, and organized dismantling of Orthodox Christianity as an organizing component of Russian political and social life. The second rejection occurred through abandonment of organized atheistic frameworks implemented by post-Orthodox and post-Stalin Soviet leadership, with subsequent adoption of Western liberal democratic models. The political leadership of the late USSR proved unable to offer Russian populations transcendental foundational principles for social and political progress that could compete effectively with Western alternatives. They were unable to develop intellectual and cultural frameworks that could provide adequate responses to Western ideological influence and organized expansion of liberal democratic values. By the beginning of major political reforms, substantial portions of the Soviet population had adopted individualistic and consumerist attitudes similar to those prevalent in Western societies. Post-Orthodox and post-Soviet Russia, under leadership committed to liberal democratic transformation, has struggled to acquire coherent foundational principles for effective policy development and implementation. This process has continued for more than a quarter century. It has been accompanied by ongoing scholarly and political discussions about finding appropriate national identity, adopting suitable universal values, and developing effective democratic institutions and civil society organizations. Political scientists correctly observe that governmental networks worldwide face increasing challenges in effectiveness, because they often account for only narrow ranges of motivation for political behavior among their populations. The deep foundational and spiritual commitments of large populations are frequently not adequately understood in contemporary political science research. As a result, they are often inadequately considered in strategic planning and policy implementation. The institutional challenges facing liberal civilization, which has increasingly prioritized commercial success and material prosperity over transcendental values and meaning networks, have inadvertently strengthened the appeal of Muslim approaches with their emphasis on spiritual commitment and community solidarity. The Western world appears to be approaching critical decision points regarding the developmental path established during the Protestant Reformation and subsequent modern period. The Muslim East, with its emphasis on spiritual revival and demographic expansion rather than primarily technological innovation, directs itself toward organized strengthening of traditional values and practices. This trajectory potentially intensifies foundational differences with secular Western approaches. This creates complex strategic dynamics in contemporary international relations. Extensive Muslim expansion through demographic growth and territorial influence encounters concentrated Western progress through technological advancement and organizational efficiency. Different civilizational approaches optimize for different types of strategic capabilities. Western frameworks excel at technological innovation, economic productivity, and organizational efficiency. Muslim frameworks excel at spiritual commitment, community solidarity, and demographic vitality. Neither approach appears capable of easily adopting the foundational assumptions that create the distinctive advantages of alternative civilizational models. Western attempts to promote liberal democratic transformation in Muslim societies have achieved limited success because they require adoption of foundational assumptions about individual autonomy and secular governance that conflict with fundamental Muslim approaches to community organization and spiritual authority. Similarly, Muslim attempts to influence Western societies through demographic expansion encounter organized resistance from liberal democratic institutions and individualistic cultural values. The persistence of these foundational differences suggests that expectations of comprehensive civilizational transformation may be unrealistic given the deep historical foundations of different monotheistic approaches to human organization. Contemporary global politics may need to develop frameworks for managing foundational differences rather than expecting comprehensive transformation of alternative civilizational approaches. This would require sophisticated understanding of how different foundational frameworks create different types of strategic capabilities and limitations. The outcome of contemporary civilizational encounters will likely depend on which approaches prove most effective at adapting to changing global conditions while maintaining their distinctive foundational advantages. In our next episode, we'll examine the implications of these foundational differences for the future of global civilization. We'll explore the particular challenges facing Russia and other post-traditional societies caught between different civilizational models. How do societies navigate between contrasting foundational approaches while maintaining political effectiveness and cultural coherence? What are the long-term implications of civilizational incompatibility? If you're interested in how foundational differences create contemporary strategic challenges, subscribe to the channel. In comments, share your observations about how different civilizational approaches influence international cooperation and conflict in regions you know. See you next episode. where we'll examine three worlds and the challenges facing weaker civilizational frameworks.